So, Heavenly Father, we just thank you for another beautiful day of life. We thank you for your love and for your grace. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your kindness and for your patience and for your forgiveness. Lord, we just ask that your Holy Spirit would be present, that you would draw us closer to you. You promised us a blessing as we read the words of this book and took to heart the prophecies that were written therein. So as we turn our eyes towards you and open our hearts and our minds towards you, we ask that your Spirit would be present to um, illuminate you, to make you more glorious and more beautiful, and that we would fall in love with you even more. Just bless us, I pray, in Jesus' name. All right, so today I'm kind of finish up the introduction that we've been doing in terms of the big picture stuff for Revelation. And we ended last time talking about, um, we gave the structure of Revelation chapter 1. And I demonstrated from the structure, chiastic structure of Revelation chapter 1, that when John writes that he's in the Spirit on the Lord's day in verse 10, that this is actually the apex of the chiastic structure, and that all of Revelation chapter 1, which is introducing the book of Revelation, is actually pointing towards this event in Revelation chapter 1 as the subject of the book of Revelation. This is the revelation of Jesus, the mystery, which is to come and which has been written about. And that's so this event that John is in the Spirit on the day of the Lord, or the Lord's day, is the theme of the book of Revelation, and obviously the theme of Revelation chapter 1. As I mentioned last time, just a brief review, when he says I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, then the question is this describing the day in which John was given the revelation, or is it describing the subject or content of the revelation that John saw? Or is it both? And of course, I think that it's both. That's the way God works. It's always more than one meaning. But the emphasis, of course, on the book of Revelation as the chiastic structure is the eschatological idea of the Lord's Day, or the day of the Lord. And that's what we talked about last week. The weekly Sabbath is a type of the last day, or eschatological Sabbath. So in 6 days, then the Lord's Day, the Sabbath, and then, of course, Peter says a day is as 1,000 years when he's talking about this day of the Lord, and that's exactly what he says: 6,000 years of sin, and then the day of the Lord, 2 Peter 3:10. So this Lord's Day, or the day of the Lord, is the great day of the Lord, the end time. And I hope that you had time to go back if you looked at last week's presentation, when we went into Joel and Zechariah about the day of the Lord. If you actually look into the Bible about the day of the Lord, also in the New Testament about the day of the Lord, you begin to realize that this is the event that the Bible keeps talking about. And we have many quotes. Even Paul says the things that were written are written for those of us at the end. And then, of course, that's why, because the Bible actually highlights this idea of the day of the Lord as the time that God is going to break through time and space and intervene in human affairs. And of course, many of us are longing for that day to happen. But that's the day the Bible is talking about, the day of the Lord. So we're going to continue to talk about this, because in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And then I heard behind me a great voice as a trumpet. This idea of the voice and trumpet is also connected to the Old Testament presentations of the day of the Lord. And I just chose one quote here in Zephaniah. It's the great day of the great day of the Lord is near, the voice of the day of the Lord. And then he talks about a day of the trumpet. So the day of the Lord was a day of the voice of God, and it's a day of trumpet. So that fits in harmony with things that he says here in Revelation 1, verse 10, that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and you heard behind me a great voice as a trumpet. And then he says, after verse 11, verse 12, he says, I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks. So, of course, this artist's rendition of Revelation chapter 1 with Jesus Obviously, he doesn't understand that he's in the sanctuary, so it doesn't give it a sanctuary context, but you get the idea, the artist's idea here anyway. So he says, verse 13, and in the midst of the seven candlesticks, I saw one like unto the Son of Man. And so, before we go any further, I want to spend some time, just a few minutes, talking about the Son of Man. Actually, we could spend all night here on this. Um, so the question is, why is Jesus introduced here um, as the Son of Man? And what does this have to do with the revelation? Who is Jesus? Why is he presented this way? These are the questions that you're always asking when you're looking at Revelation. The first thing that I always do is, when you find a term in Revelation, you want to look up where else in Revelation that term is used. Obviously, that's usually when you start seeing, well, it's used 7 times, it's used here and here. But sometimes the Revelation actually says a lot by what it doesn't say. In other words, by when it quotes something or refers to something, if of one time or very few times, that also gives it significance as well. And of course, this is one of these terms. The name Son of Man, besides here in Revelation chapter 1, in the introduction to the book, it's only used in one other place in the book of Revelation, and that's Revelation 14, verse 14. And that text obviously is worth turning to, because it's going to give us insight into the day of the Lord that we're talking about. And Revelation 14:14 that we'll actually dive into when we get there. But it says that John looks, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. So obviously the references to kingship here are significant, and um, significant in terms of the context that we're talking about. So I'll try not to get diverted to Revelation 14, but that reference, I think, is significant. So we'll get to that later. So you'll notice the Son of Man, we went earlier when we were talking about Revelation being a continuation of Daniel. We noticed the reference in Revelation 1:13 to the Son of Man. We also recognize its connection to Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14. But we also recognize in Revelation chapter 1, there was actually 7 references in Revelation 1 that corresponded to 7 parallel references in Daniel 7, 13, and 14, which connected the event of Revelation chapter 1 that the book of Revelation is about, specifically to Daniel 7, 13, and 14. And this is obviously very significant. So the connection of Son of Man, when you look at Daniel 7, 13, and 14, you'll notice that, this is a coronation scene, that the Son of Man is given glory, dominion, and a kingdom. And then it says that all peoples, nations, and language serve him, that his dominion is an everlasting dominion, one that will not be taken away, right? And so we see that this is a coronation of the king, coronation of the Son of Man, but we also notice that there's an invitation, or there's a decree that goes out, that all the peoples and nations and languages should serve him. Of course, the word for serve and the word worship are the same word. Actually, Jesus used the same word when he was describing, remember, being tempted in the wilderness. Thou shalt serve the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou worship, or thou shalt worship the Lord your God, and him only shalt thou serve. That is actually the way he said it when he talked to the devil in the wilderness. But the idea of serving and worship are the same idea. Who you serve, or that's who you worship. So this idea that I'm bringing with you to the Son of Man is that this is a judgment of the living scene. When Christ becomes king, the decree goes forth to worship him, and those who worship him obviously are receiving him as their king, become part of his kingdom. Those who refuse to worship him, they're rebels, and they're at enmity with the king. And of course, that's what causes the conflict. So this again here, and then we'll go to other places in the Bible to show, but it's clear here in Daniel 7:13 to 14 that when Christ becomes king, this is the judgment of the living. This is an important connection to the name, the Son of Man, this concept of the judgment of the living. So why or who is the Son of Man? Well, we mentioned Daniel 7:13 and 14. I'm going to mention some other texts here for you. I chose Matthew 12:8 simply because this is when Jesus talked about the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. And that's, of course, the Lord of the Sabbath, the day of the Lord. That's what we were talking about, Revelation chapter 1. And so here in this verse, when Jesus was declaring himself the Lord of the Sabbath, he declares himself that as in terms of calls himself the Son of Man. Of course, Jesus called himself the Son of Man very often. And Matthew 24, these verses in verse 27 and verse 30 and 37 and 44, of course, are all in the context of last day events, but he refers to himself as the Son of Man. He says, you shall see the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, right? So all this stuff is about the Son of Man and the coming of the day of the Lord, or the coming of the day that the Son of Man God will intervene, as we mentioned, in human affairs. The Matthew 26:64 I put here because that's actually in Jesus's trial. And then Jesus told the high priest that you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God, coming in power, right? And then, of course, Luke 18:8, Jesus asked the question, Luke 18:8, when the Son of Man comes, will he find any faith left on the earth? Again, the idea is that the Son of Man coming is connected to this great day at the end. And then, of course, in verse 31, he says, in that day, he which shall be upon the housetop. I'm sorry, that's chapter 17. Luke 18, verse 31. He says, then he took unto him the 12 and said, behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and all things that were written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man shall be accomplished. So I chose that verse specifically because he talks about all the things the prophets had written about the Son of Man. Again, the prophets were writing about the day of the Lord. Now, there's many texts that you can look up about the Son of Man. But I'm sharing this with you, and that love me about Ezekiel. Ezekiel is another place in Scripture that the word Son of Man is used. Ezekiel is called the Son of Man, actually 87 times in the book of Ezekiel. And I think this is significant because the book of Ezekiel obviously is the judgment living. He's the fourth prophet for the time of Daniel when Babylon took over the Jews, Israel, conquered Israel. And of course, so Ezekiel literally sees the moving chariot, and there's the actually judgment of the living process, where when they started the judgment of the living, they go to Ezekiel chapter 8, 9, and 10 to do that. So what I'm suggesting here that's significant is that when the name Son of Man is used, it's actually used in the context of the judgment, a probationary period in the judgment taking place, or the judgment of the living, like you see here in Ezekiel. And of course, in the Gospels, we know that the 70 weeks, or the 490 years of probationary time, is about up for Israel, for the Jews. And so Christ is presenting himself as the Son of Man because this is their judgment. The judgment of living has taken place, and people are making decisions. So I'm suggesting to you that not only is the term Son of Man connected to his exaltation as being king, but of course, the king is the judge. So that when he becomes king, that's the time of judgment. So the Son of Man is a phrase that is being used to describe judgment. Specifically, it's going to be referring to the judgment of the living. Of course, that's significant in terms of what the book of Revelation is describing. So you'll notice the disciples' experience on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus in Matthew 16:28, he said that some of you standing here will not taste death until, again, you have this last day eschatological day of the Lord idea. But notice he uses the phrase Son of Man, which is, again, very significant. So again, that's just in line with all the things that we see the way the Bible, the scriptures use the phrase "the Son of Man," the idea of coming into his kingdom. To come into your kingdom is to become king, obviously. And we'll get back to this experience here in a few minutes. So Revelation chapter 1, uh, 13, when it introduces it introduces the Son of Man, and then it goes into the sevenfold description of Christ in Revelation chapter 1. And of course, the fact that there's a sevenfold description have already talked about is very significant. Seven being the number of perfection or completion. So this idea of the sevenfold description actually comes from description of the Son of Man comes from the day of the Lord, comes from Daniel chapter 10. And Daniel chapter 10 is where Daniel himself sees a revelation of glorified Christ, and he's described with this in this terms of seven descriptions. And these seven descriptions are actually the ones here in Daniel chapter 10. And if you're looking for a verse in Daniel chapter 10, let me give you the verse real quickly. So some of you might be looking at it's verses 5 and 6. When Daniel sees he's by the river and he sees this glorified Christ, and he gives his sevenfold description. So this is the same experience, and this is the point. This is the same experience that John has, Daniel is having in Daniel chapter 10. And so the question comes, well, what is the context of Daniel chapter 10 that makes it a type of the day of the Lord, that it makes it a type or a connection to what John sees when John is being shown the day of the Lord? Now, and again, just like the Son of Man, we could have spent all night talking about just that and still be talking about it. We could spend all night here talking about Daniel chapter 10. I'm just going to kind of give an overview, big picture idea, and then of course when we start discussing things, we can jump into details if people have questions. But the historical context of Daniel chapter 10 is very significant because Daniel is at the end of a probationary period. The 70 years of captivity were up, and Daniel is looking for the release from captivity. But this is also, the 70 years was not just a time of probation, time of captivity for the Jews. It was also a probationary time for Babylon. And so what's going to happen here in Daniel chapter 10 is there's actually a new king. You remember in 539 that Darius, when Cyrus conquers Babylon, Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom. Of course, that's the story of Daniel chapter 9. And it's the story of Daniel in the lion's den by King Darius when he was going to exalt Daniel. And then, of course, it isn't until his Darius is 62. He's an older gentleman, and Daniel chapter 10, Darius has died, and now Cyrus is being exalted to his nephew is being exalted to the throne as the king of the Medes and the Persians. So there's a new king, and of course, this new king, Cyrus, in Isaiah 45, is the one who's actually called the Anointed One. He's actually described as the Messiah. And this Messiah, this Cyrus, is actually going to has not only conquered Babylon, but he is going to set the captives free. So Cyrus becomes this type of Michael standing up, and actually that's what Daniel says. That actually it's Gabriel says to Daniel that Michael is the one that stands with Gabriel against the Prince of Persia and against the Prince of Greece that's coming. So this idea, the historical context of Daniel chapter 10 deals with not just a new king, any king, but actually the coming of Cyrus, who is a type of the Messiah, and that he's going to set the captives free. And Babylon is going, obviously, Babylon has fallen. Babylon is going to be destroyed, and God's people are going to be set free. And then there's going to go forth a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, and then eventually the sanctuary will be rebuilt, and the kingdom of Israel will be restored. So this is the context of Daniel chapter 10. And this context of Daniel seeing this revelation of Christ in Daniel chapter 10 is the context or the type of the antitype of the book of Revelation, because we're waiting for our coming of our Babylon and set us free from the sin of this world, and that this will come with a end of a probationary period, or the close of probation, not just the close of probation for God's people, but also a close of probation for the world that are going to be holding God's people captive. Of course, that's Satan. He's the king of this world and holding God's people captive. So, in these two regards, this revelation that John has um, mirrors the experience of John. So that's the historical context. Now I want to get into the specific experience itself that Daniel has that mirrors exactly John's experience. And this is significant as well, because it's not just a revelation of the larger context of the day of the Lord, about how God's going to intervene and cause judgment for the world in terms of how it's treated God's people, but an encounter of God's people with God. And of course, we know that judgment begins at the house of God. So if judgment is taking place, if Christ's living takes place, of course, that starts with us. What I was trying to share was that Daniel's experience in Daniel chapter 10 is the same as John's experience in that he's having, is what God is showing him, what God's people would face in the last days, the eschatological day of the Lord. And so when Daniel sees the revelation at the side of the river, then he sees the glory of God. And then and please go to Daniel chapter 10 and spend some time reading and looking at the details here. Some of you, I've studied that with you, and I think maybe we could put a link down or something connecting to one of the previous studies of Daniel chapter 10. But so when Daniel sees this revelation, of course, he falls at the feet of the glorified Lord as dead. And then Daniel says that he spoke to me, and then he touched me. Actually, he talks about him touched him 3 times. And then he says he strengthened me and he made me stand. So Daniel goes through this death resurrection experience when he encounters the glorified Christ. And of course, that's significant in terms of what we're talking about. By the way, we talked about Revelation chapter 14. The end of Revelation 14:14 talks about the Son of Man and being seen as the king on the cloud. Revelation 14 verse 13 talks about, blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, because their rest from their labors and their deeds will follow them. So there's this death resurrection experience that takes place. Of course, any of the ancients that would understand that when you came into the presence of a king, that you would fall on your face before the king, and then you would wait for them to extend their scepter before you had life. And of course, remember the story of Esther, for example, when she goes in before the king and she was not invited to come. If he doesn't extend her scepter, what's going to happen to her, right? And so when she goes in, she bows before him. You always bow before you go to the king. And by the way, that's a symbol that you're dying, that you're surrendering yourself to him, and actually you're literally dying. And then when he speaks to you, then if he extends grace to you, then you have life. And then if he invites you to stand, then he speaks to you, you can stand up. Well, that's what's going on here with Daniel in Daniel chapter 10. He's having this experience of encountering the King of the universe. He goes through this death resurrection experience, and then he's strengthened so that God can speak to him. And then it's in verse 14 that the angel says to Daniel that, that I'm showing you what will happen, what will befall your people in the last days. So this is the encounter with God. By the way, this will happen to all of us when Christ comes again at the second coming, when we behold his face. Mrs. White very interestingly describes that she says every face turns pale and everyone realizes that they're lost. And then of course, then she says that that there's a voice saying, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. That's actually a quoting of Christ's words in Corinthians. But she says that when Christ speaks that phrase, then those of us who have accepted Christ as our King, then then we have life, and we are no longer, dying. And but in that brief moment, she describes all of us realize how lost we are. And of course, at that point, then this when God's people are Yahooing, and then those who are not his people are crying for the rocks and the mountains to fall on them and to hide them from the face of him who sits on the throne, right? So the idea is that when Christ comes, when you encounter God, you die, and then of course he's going to resurrect you. He's going to give you life. Death and resurrection is the path to life, and that's the experience of encountering the King. That's what Daniel is experiencing. That's the same thing that John is experiencing, because you'll notice that John has the same experience as at the next slide now. So you'll notice in Revelation chapter 1, John sees the glory of Christ, the sevenfold description. He falls at his feet as dead. And then Jesus speaks to him and he touches him. And then because he speaks to him and touches him, then he gives him the commission to write down what he sees. And then of course, John is strengthened to do what God has called him to do. So John's experience is the same exact experience that Daniel had. That's the point that I'm making. And that's the experience that we are supposed to have as we wrestle with the book of Revelation. We're supposed to encounter Christ in various stages of his glory. And the more we encounter him, and the more that we die and enter in, the more we can encounter him. Same idea of Moses going up the mountain, asking God to show him his glory. It's the same experience. Now, this is exactly the same experience that the disciples had on the Mount of Transfiguration. Remember, Jesus told them that some wouldn't die till they saw the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, when Peter, James, and John go up the mountain and they awaken and they see Christ glorified, they see his face shining as the sun. And that's exactly what the description that you see in Daniel chapter 10 and Revelation chapter 1 of Christ, that his face is shining like the sun. And there's a voice that they hear out of the cloud, which is very interesting. The Son of Man is connected to the cloud. And when they hear the voice out of the cloud, then they fall on their face as if they're dead. They fall on their face before the Lord. And then the next thing that happens, of course, is that Jesus touches them. And of course, they pass from death to life. And then that's when Peter, obviously there's this discussion going on. But so the point here is that Jesus was telling them ahead of time that they were going to have this experience, and it was important for them to recognize who Jesus was and see him come in his kingdom. But this obviously is a type of, again, what the book of Revelation is describing, the revelation of Jesus Christ when he becomes king, the Son of Man, and that when we encounter him, then we pass from death to life. So we talked about the Son of Man, then we talked about Daniel chapter 10 in terms of the day of the Lord and the context, historical context, that's the type. And then the third thing that we're talking about here is the actual experience of encountering God. And we are supposed to be wrestling to have that experience. Of course, this is what we do in our daily devotions and our daily prayers. We're seeking the presence of God. And as we seek the presence of God, then self dies and that Christ lives, and that we are being restored or recreated in his image and in his likeness, which is obviously the primary aspect of the book of Revelation, right? That we want the revelation of Jesus Christ to be in us, in our thoughts and our characters. So this is the kind of wrap up, the conclusion of the introduction here, that John saw Jesus on the day of the Lord, and that when John sees it, he has the same death resurrection experience that Daniel has, that Peter had, that Moses had, that everybody that's ever encountered the glorified Lord has. That they fall on their face, they die, there's a death, and then there's being brought back to life or restored to life. And that when John sees these things, then he's instructed to write these things, write the stuff down that he has seen, to actually write down his experience so that it becomes a prophecy or a type for those who would read it, so they would understand what God is calling them to. And he's not just describing the experience, he's also obviously writing down the content and the subject of the book of Revelation. And that's why this Revelation chapter 1, this introduction, is so important, because the rest of the book of Revelation is the revelation of what he's writing down. It is the revelation of this encounter. It's the unfolding of the revelation of the day of the Lord. Does that make sense? So the Son of Man is coming into his kingdom. And then when, of course, when the Son of Man comes into his kingdom, that means that judgment begins, the judgment of living begins. And then people, the different individuals or groups within are going to have an encounter with God, and there's going to be death and resurrection. There's going to be life, or like in Daniel chapter 10, people are going to run away afraid and they're going to hide, or they're going to run out of his presence and try to play games with reality because they don't want the light to come. And that's what of course, the book of Revelation is going to describe: the growers and the non-growers, and the light shining going forth. And that's the revelation of Jesus.